Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by acknowledging that Professor Omarova's thesis was certainly written a long time ago. The reason it is relevant is because it was advertised on her resume up through 2017. I think it would be completely relevant to this discussion. What apparently some of my Democratic colleagues want to really avoid is a full discussion of her policy views, but that's what we're going to have this morning. Now, I've read a variety of Professor Omarova's writings. I've watched her videos of her speaking. I have absolutely no doubt she's extremely intelligent, very knowledgeable, and she's an experienced law professor. My concern with Professor Omarova is her long history of promoting ideas that she herself describes as, quote, radical, end quote. I agree that they're radical, and they can fairly be described also as socialist. In fact, I've never seen a more radical nominee to be a federal regulator, and I'll be using her words. Let's talk about some of Professor Omarova's radical ideas. For starters, we know she wants to, and I quote, effectively end banking as we know it, end quote. Now, what does that mean? Well, she's told us what that means. In, quote, the People's Ledger, that's the name of a paper that she wrote, she published just last month. She outlined her plan for nationalizing retail banking. Under her plan, and I quote, central bank accounts fully replace, rather than uneasily coexist with, private bank deposits, end quote. So in other words, you couldn't have an account with a community bank. Your money would be held by the government at the Federal Reserve. Now, I remember well countless Pennsylvanians outraged over recent Democrat plans for the IRS to get a certain amount of personal banking information. Imagine their reaction to having the government actually take over their bank accounts. Professor Omarova also has a proposal to control the money supply through these individual Fed accounts, as she calls them, including when necessary, and I quote, implementing a contractionary monetary policy by debiting those accounts. Now, for those who are not accountants, debiting means basically subtracting. This, she allows, could be, and I quote, perceived as the government taking away people's money, end quote. Well, I think I know why it would be perceived that way, because it would be the government taking away people's money. Professor Omarova's plan would devastate all banks, but especially community banks, because they rely on the deposit taking for the lending money to local businesses and residents. So what would happen in these banks under Professor Omarova's plan to outlaw their business model? Well, according to the People's Ledger that she wrote, Professor Omarova might allow these community banks to continue to exist, but only as, quote, franchisees, end quote, for the government, if they qualify for a license to, quote, operate physical branches and ATMs on the Fed's behalf, end quote. I see. Except that Professor Omarova would deny these banks their source of funding, which is deposits. And without a source of funding, banks can't very well lend to a woman who wants to open a new restaurant in town, a tool dye shop looking to expand, newlyweds who want to buy their first home, or pretty much anything else. Now, given that she wants community banks to become vassals of the government, it's no wonder that the Independent Community Bankers of America and banking associations from 41 states so far oppose her nomination. As Ricky Leal, Senior Vice President at First Community Bank in Texas, stated, and I quote, the entire theory in banking, especially local community banking, is based on gathering up deposits from the local community and loaning back out into the local community so that those dollars are cycled through and stay local. You'd lose all that. A world without the local deposit, it would change banking as we know it, end quote. But of course, that's the idea. Professor Omarova says, again in the People's Ledger, that one reason she wants the Fed to become everyone's bank is to, and I quote, maximize its capacity to channel credit to productive uses in the nation's economy, end quote. Now, it's troubling to ponder how she or anyone in government would choose to define productive uses in our economy. How about loans to oil, gas, and coal companies? Would Professor Omarova consider them productive? Well, we actually know the answer. Earlier this year, at a social wealth seminar, she said publicly of these energy businesses, and I quote, we want them to go bankrupt if we want to tackle climate change, end quote. She also said at an investment and decarbonization seminar this year, and I quote, "The way we basically get rid of those carbon financiers is we starve them of their source of capital," end quote. And she's created an entire blueprint for how the government could do this, and she has advocated her plan, including in testimony to Congress. Seems to me the last thing we need now, with some Americans paying close to $5 a gallon for gas and home heating costs soaring due to the Biden administration's disastrous energy policies, is a banking regulator who wants to push perfectly legal and economically necessary companies that employ millions of Americans into bankruptcy. But Professor Omarova's radical ideas don't stop there. She has a plan for the government, through the Fed, to replace the free market in setting what she calls, and I quote, "systemically important prices," end quote. But these are things she lists. These are things like food, wages, energy. And since the administration's done such a great job on inflation, I'm sure Americans can't wait until the Fed starts directly controlling prices for eggs and milk and rent. And this isn't the only time that Professor Omarova has expressed support for government control on wages. As she tweeted in 2019, her words, and I quote, "Say what you will about the old USSR, there was no gender pay gap there. Market doesn't always know best," end quote. I suspect Professor Omarova may claim that as comptroller of the currency, she wouldn't have the power to enact all of her radical views. But the truth is, the comptroller is a very powerful regulator. It wields enormous powers through bank chartering, regulation, enforcement, and especially through its opaque supervision process. The comptroller is also a member of the FDIC board and the Financial Stability Oversight Council, America's financial superregulator. Professor Omarova may also claim that her writings are just thought experiments. But for the last decade, she's been a consistent, forceful advocate for these radical ideas in her writings, in public statements, and in testimony before Congress. Now, taken in their totality, her ideas do amount to a socialist manifesto for American financial services. She wants to nationalize the banking system, put in place price controls, create a command and control economy where the government allocates resources explicitly, instead of free men and women making their own decisions about the goods and services they want to buy and sell in an open market. These are exactly the kind of socialist ideas that have failed everywhere in the world they've been tried. In my view, Professor Omarova's policy views are too radical, and preserving the prosperity that our free market economy makes possible is too important to make her our nation's top banking regulator. So I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of opposition to Professor Omarova's nomination from 65 industry, taxpayer advocate, consumer, and women's organizations, including the Independent Women's Forum, Independent Community Bankers of America, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Taxpayers Union, and banking associations from 41 states. I'd also like to enter into the record letters of opposition from 21 state auditors and treasurers representing 17 states and the governor of Texas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.